Some of the most successful inventions in history were scams. They promised unlimited energy. They promised miracle cures. They promised revolutionary machines that would change the world. Investors funded them. Governments endorsed them. Media amplified them. Millions of dollars flowed into devices that never worked. These were not engineering breakthroughs. They were carefully constructed invention scams, designed to attract capital before reality caught up. Behind every impossible machine was the same pattern: promise innovation, control the demonstration, secure the money. This is the story of fake inventions that raised millions. Every fake breakthrough follows a predictable architecture. It begins with the claim of disruption. The invention is described as revolutionary. Existing science is portrayed as incomplete. Conventional experts are framed as resistant to change. The inventor positions the device as years ahead of its time. Language replaces measurable evidence. The machine is said to overturn physics, medicine, or engineering limits. Specific performance metrics are vague. The promise is expansive. The explanation is selective. Scarcity is introduced immediately. Access is limited to private demonstrations. Technical details are withheld under claims of proprietary protection. Patents are referenced as proof of legitimacy. Few investors read patent filings in detail. Controlled demonstrations become central. Observers are shown results. They are not allowed to inspect inputs. Testing conditions are managed exclusively by the inventor. Independent replication is delayed. Complex terminology creates perceived sophistication. Scientific language obscures practical verification. Appeal to authority reinforces credibility. Advisory boards include respected names. Former military officials appear on letterhead. University affiliations are implied or loosely connected. Photographs with prominent figures circulate publicly. Media coverage repeats the inventor's claims. Early investment rounds close quickly. Equity is framed as scarce opportunity. Projected revenue curves are steep. The invention is positioned as inevitable progress. Skepticism is described as outdated thinking. Urgency accelerates commitment. Capital flows before verification. The product remains unfinished. Revenue remains projected. Validation remains internal. The architecture converts narrative into valuation. Fraud in invention markets is rarely impulsive. It is structured. The same sequence appears across centuries. Promise disruption, control the demonstration, secure the funding. Only later does scrutiny arrive. By then, millions have already been raised. In 1872, John Ernst Worrell Keely announced a revolutionary energy discovery. He claimed to have harnessed a new force he called etheric energy. Keely stated that his machine could generate power without fuel. The claim directly contradicted established thermodynamic principles. The first law of thermodynamics had been formalized decades earlier. Energy could not be created from nothing. Keely dismissed conventional physics as incomplete. He described his system as vibratory and sympathetic. The terminology was complex. The mechanism was undefined. Demonstrations were theatrical. Observers reported dramatic bursts of motion. Metal spheres rotated, weights lifted, pressure gauges fluctuated. The source of energy was concealed. Independent scientists were not permitted to inspect internal components. The machine was kept partially covered during operation. Investors were impressed. In 1874, the Keely Motor Company was formed in Philadelphia. Capital began flowing into the venture. By the 1880s, Keely had raised approximately $5 million. This was an enormous sum for the period. Prominent investors defended the invention publicly. Demonstrations were carefully staged. Hidden compressed air systems were later discovered. Secret tubing ran beneath floors. Assistants controlled valves out of sight. The appearance of perpetual motion depended on concealed inputs. Technical schematics were never fully disclosed. Keely refused full replication attempts. He insisted the device required his personal tuning. The mystique reinforced exclusivity. Years passed without commercial product. No functional motor entered industrial use. Revenue never materialized. Supporters attributed delays to sabotage and skepticism. The company's valuation rested on belief. Media coverage amplified the spectacle. Scientific journals remained cautious. Verification was postponed repeatedly. When Keely died in 1998, inspection of his laboratory exposed the fraud. Hidden air pipes were found embedded in walls. The machine could not operate independently. The illusion collapsed quickly. The pattern was clear. Scientific complexity masked physical impossibility. Secrecy prevented replication. Capital substituted for proof. The promise of unlimited energy overrode basic physics. The structure mirrored the architecture of invention fraud. Disruption language, controlled demonstration, delayed verification, millions raised before reality intervened.
In the early 20th century, medical technology became fertile ground for invention fraud. Public anxiety about chronic illness was widespread. Regulatory oversight was limited before the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act in the United States. Inventors exploited this gap. One of the most prominent examples was Albert Abrams. In the 1910s and 1920s, Abrams promoted devices he called radionic instruments. He claimed they could diagnose and treat nearly any disease. The machines consisted of dials, wires, and sealed boxes. Abrams argued that every disease emitted a unique vibrational frequency. By tuning the device, operators could identify illness remotely. Scientific validation was absent. Demonstrations were tightly controlled. Samples were tested without independent verification. Patients reported improvement. Placebo effects were not considered. Celebrity endorsements reinforced credibility. Physicians purchased licenses to operate the devices. Training seminars were organized. Operators paid fees to join the system. In 1923, investigative committees in the United States began reviewing the claims. Medical associations requested independent testing. Abrams resisted transparent replication. He insisted critics misunderstood his methods. Laboratory trials failed to reproduce diagnostic accuracy. Despite this, sales continued. By the mid-1920s, radionic machines had generated millions of dollars in revenue. The appeal was structural. Chronic diseases lacked reliable treatments. Desperation increased tolerance for uncertainty. Complex electrical terminology implied modern science. Wooden boxes filled with wires appeared technical. Dials created the illusion of calibration. Patients were shown readings. They were not shown evidence. Licensing created recurring income. Practitioners became financially dependent on belief. Media coverage amplified curiosity. Skeptical reporting was less prominent than promotional stories. Regulatory agencies lacked enforcement clarity. Prosecution was inconsistent. After Abrams' death in 1924, exposure intensified. Independent evaluations concluded the devices had no diagnostic value. Investigations described the instruments as elaborate placebo machines. Sales declined, but the model survived. Similar devices reappeared under new names in later decades. The pattern was consistent: universal healing claim, complex mechanism, limited verification, revenue before validation. Health anxiety converted uncertainty into capital. Medical invention fraud did not rely on technological plausibility. It relied on psychological vulnerability. The structure mirrored earlier energy scams: innovation language, controlled demonstration, delayed scrutiny, millions raised before proof was required. In 2003, a 19-year-old entrepreneur named Elizabeth Holmes founded Theranos. The company claimed it could run hundreds of blood tests from a single drop. Traditional laboratory testing required multiple vials.
Theranos promised speed, affordability, and minimal invasiveness. The narrative positioned the technology as transformative for healthcare. Holmes described the device as a compact automated laboratory. The machine was called the Edison. Technical details were tightly controlled. Employees signed strict confidentiality agreements. Laboratory access was restricted internally. Investors were not permitted full inspection of core technology. Demonstrations were curated. Machines shown to visitors were not always operational. Data presented in pitch meetings was selective. Independent validation was limited. Despite this, credibility accumulated rapidly. By 2014, Theranos was valued at approximately $9 billion. Major investors included venture capital firms and private family offices. The board of directors featured former secretaries of state and senior military leaders. Few had laboratory science backgrounds. Elite endorsement substituted for technical review. Media coverage was overwhelmingly positive. Profiles described Holmes as a visionary innovator. Comparisons to Steve Jobs reinforced the narrative. Walgreens signed a partnership agreement to deploy testing centers. Retail locations were prepared before full validation. Revenue projections expanded aggressively. Internal performance data contradicted public claims. Traditional analyzers were used to run many tests. Error rates were significant. Whistleblowers raised concerns. Concerns were managed internally. Legal pressure was used to silence former employees. The culture emphasized secrecy. Skepticism was framed as disloyalty. In 2015, investigative reporting by the Wall Street Journal questioned the technology. Independent laboratory experts demanded evidence. Regulators initiated inspections. Findings revealed unreliable results. Partnerships were suspended. Valuation collapsed. By 2018, Theranos dissolved. In 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on multiple counts of fraud. The structure followed a familiar pattern. Disruption language preceded verification. Elite authority replaced technical validation. Demonstration was controlled. Scrutiny was delayed. Billions were raised before evidence was confirmed. The invention did not function as advertised. The architecture of fraud adapted to modern venture capital. The pattern remained consistent. Promise innovation, control information, secure funding. Verification arrived last. Invention fraud does not only target private investors, it also exploits government contracts. Military and defense funding create unique vulnerabilities. National security urgency reduces transparency. Secrecy limits external verification. Oversight becomes compartmentalized. In 2004, a company called Advanced Tactical Ordnance Systems proposed a revolutionary battlefield detector. It claimed the device could identify explosives and narcotics from long distances. The product was marketed to security forces in Iraq and other regions. The device was later known as the ADE-651. Its design resembled a handheld scanner with a swiveling antenna. The technology was described as electrostatic molecular detection. Scientific validation was absent. The internal components were minimal. The device contained no active power source. Despite this, contracts were signed. Between 2005 and 2010, millions of dollars were paid for procurement. Some reports estimate contracts exceeding $40 million. Demonstrations were controlled by the manufacturer. Testing environments were arranged by company representatives. Officials were not permitted to disassemble the device. Operational claims were not independently verified. Operational claims were not independently verified. The urgency of counterterrorism accelerated purchasing decisions. Field reports questioning reliability were initially dismissed. The device failed to consistently detect explosives. False positives and false negatives occurred frequently. However, secrecy and hierarchy discouraged public criticism. Military procurement structures relied on internal validation. External scientists were not consulted early. Media coverage was limited during deployment. It was not until investigative reporting and forensic examination that flaws became widely known. In 2010, laboratory testing demonstrated the device had no detection capability. It functioned similarly to a novelty item. In 2013, the manufacturer was convicted of fraud in the United Kingdom. The case revealed extensive exaggeration of capabilities. Government endorsement had conferred legitimacy. Procurement authority substituted for scientific proof. The pattern was consistent. Urgency reduced scrutiny. Classification restricted transparency. Authority replaced replication. Millions were allocated before technical evaluation occurred. The illusion was sustained by institutional structure. Defense contracts provided funding shielded from open review. The invention did not require functional technology. It required controlled demonstration and limited inspection. National security framing amplified trust. The structure mirrored earlier civilian scams. Disruption claim, restricted access, accelerated capital flow. Verification delayed until after deployment. Fraud adapts to context. In defense markets, secrecy becomes the protective layer. The underlying architecture remains unchanged.
Invention fraud rarely scales without media participation. Visibility converts obscurity into legitimacy. Early coverage is often optimistic. Journalists seek breakthrough narratives. Complex technologies are difficult to evaluate quickly. Press cycles reward novelty. In 1919, major newspapers covered John Keely's claims with fascination. In the 1920s, radionic devices received feature articles describing modern healing. In 2014, national publications profiled Theranos as transformative. Media exposure preceded verification. Profiles emphasized personality over performance. Inventors were framed as visionaries. Photographs reinforced credibility. Laboratory settings were staged for interviews. Journalists were shown curated data. Technical questions were deferred. Deadlines limited deep investigation. Positive coverage attracted additional investors. Investors cited press validation in decision-making. Coverage was repeated across outlets. Repetition created familiarity. Familiarity generated trust. Skeptical voices were initially marginalized. Critical analysis appeared later. By the time investigative reporting emerged, valuations had already expanded. In 2015, the Wall Street Journal's reporting on Theranos marked a turning point. Prior to that, dozens of articles had reinforced optimism. The same pattern appeared in earlier eras. Promotional stories outpaced scientific review. Press attention created momentum. Momentum increased funding rounds. Funding amplified newsworthiness. The cycle reinforced itself. Media institutions did not necessarily intend to enable fraud. They operated within structural incentives. Access journalism depends on cooperation. Inventors control access. Exclusive interviews provide competitive advantage. Critical reporting risks losing future access. Technical complexity discourages rapid fact-checking. Specialist expertise is not always consulted. Visual demonstrations translate well to print and broadcast. Invisible flaws do not. Early-stage companies are evaluated on potential, not proof. Headlines emphasize possibility. Nuance is condensed. Over time, repetition hardens narrative. Public perception shifts from curiosity to confidence. Confidence attracts capital. Capital sustains illusion. Exposure often requires adversarial journalism. Whistleblowers supply documents. Regulators provide data. Verification becomes public. The role of media is not singularly culpable. It is structurally influential.
Visibility equals credibility in emerging markets. In invention fraud, amplification precedes authentication. The pattern repeats. Optimistic coverage, escalating valuation, delayed scrutiny, correction after capital concentration. Fraud adapts to media environments. The architecture remains stable. Invention fraud does not depend on uninformed investors. It frequently attracts sophisticated capital. Experienced investors participate. Institutional funds participate. Technical advisors participate. The pattern is not irrational enthusiasm. It is structured psychology. Fear of missing out accelerates decision-making. When early investors report gains, others follow. Reputation risk influences behavior. Declining to invest in a breakthrough can appear negligent. Participation becomes defensive. Herd behavior emerges in elite networks. Private meetings reinforce consensus. Skepticism is softened in group settings. Authority bias reinforces confidence. If respected figures endorse the invention, doubt decreases. In 2014, Theranos secured investments from prominent family offices. Board members included former cabinet officials. Few challenged the core science publicly. The cost of public dissent was high. In earlier eras, Keely's supporters included wealthy industrialists. Radionic devices were purchased by licensed physicians. Defense procurement officers approved questionable devices under urgency. Across cases, professional credentials did not prevent error. Confidence in personal judgment increased risk tolerance. Complexity discouraged deep review. Investors deferred to technical explanations they did not fully understand. Projection models emphasized market size. Large addressable markets justified high valuation. Early access created exclusivity. Exclusivity increased perceived opportunity. The language of disruption implied inevitability. Missing the opportunity implied backward thinking. Capital allocation followed narrative strength. Due diligence shortened under competitive pressure. Term sheets moved quickly. Background checks focused on character rather than functionality. Financial modeling replaced physical testing. Confidence was distributed socially. Optimism spread through trusted networks. Dissent appeared isolated. Invention fraud exploits this environment. It does not require mass ignorance. It requires concentrated belief. When multiple credible actors commit capital, validation appears collective. Collective validation substitutes for evidence. By the time independent testing occurs, investment rounds have closed. Loss aversion then delays withdrawal. Admitting error damages reputation. Investors defend positions longer than rational. The psychology is systematic. It is not impulsive greed. It is structured incentive alignment. When capital, status, and narrative converge, skepticism weakens. Fraud flourishes in environments of shared confidence. The architecture depends on human coordination. Sophistication does not eliminate vulnerability. It can amplify it. Invention fraud often reaches a stage where revenue appears real. Financial statements begin to circulate. Pre-orders are recorded as income. Deposits are treated as confirmation of demand. Projected licensing deals are described as secured partnerships. Memorandums of understanding are presented as binding contracts. Accounting categories expand. Deferred revenue is emphasized. Future milestones are counted as present value. Valuation models incorporate optimistic adoption rates. In 2014, Theranos reported hundreds of millions in projected revenue. Actual operational revenue was minimal. In earlier decades, radionic operators counted training fees as medical validation. Keely's company capitalized investment inflows as evidence of viability. Defense contractors cited procurement letters as proof of effectiveness. Paper value replaced functional value. Financial presentations became central. Spreadsheets substituted for laboratory results. Forecast curves rose steeply. Cash burn was reframed as growth investment. Debt was structured as bridge financing. Convertible notes delayed valuation reality. New funding rounds validated prior rounds. Mark-to-market accounting inflated perceived worth. Audits were internal or limited in scope. Independent forensic review was postponed. Board meetings focused on fundraising strategy. Operational metrics were secondary. When revenue targets were missed, timelines were extended. Announcements emphasized upcoming breakthroughs. The illusion of inevitability persisted. Market enthusiasm depends on forward-looking optimism. Investors evaluated potential rather than output. Large total addressable market figures justified delay. Each quarter without proof was framed as strategic development. Media coverage reported valuation, not verification. Analysts cited headline numbers. Few questioned underlying cash flow. In 2015, independent investigation into Theranos revealed major discrepancies. Financial statements could not compensate for technical failure. The same pattern appeared in earlier frauds. Complex accounting extended the illusion. Capital inflow disguised operational weakness. Revenue mirage delayed exposure. By the time verification occurred, millions had already been allocated. Paper growth cannot replace physical performance. Balance sheets can obscure mechanical absence. The revenue stage is critical. It creates the impression of sustainability. Fraud persists longest when numbers appear legitimate. Accounting language softens skepticism. Forecast replaces function. Projection replaces proof. When scrutiny intensifies, financial narratives collapse alongside technology. The architecture remains consistent. Demonstration attracts capital. Capital builds valuation. Valuation is defended by financial presentation. Verification arrives last. Invention fraud collapses when verification becomes public. Exposure rarely begins internally. It begins with dissent. Whistleblowers identify inconsistencies. Employees question data integrity. Internal emails document concerns. When ignored, some approach journalists. Investigative reporting introduces independent scrutiny. In 2015, the Wall Street Journal published findings on Theranos. Former employees described unreliable testing. Laboratory experts analyzed technical feasibility. Regulators initiated inspections. Documentation was subpoenaed. In earlier eras, similar exposure mechanisms appeared. After John Keely's death in 1898, his laboratory was examined. Hidden compressed air pipes were discovered. Radionic devices were tested in controlled clinical settings. Results failed to validate claims. In 2010, independent evaluation of the ADE 651 showed no detection capability. Verification replaced demonstration. Replication replaced presentation. The collapse phase is procedural. Media coverage shifts tone. Investors reassess risk. Partnerships are suspended. Funding rounds halt. Valuation contracts rapidly. Legal inquiries follow. Regulatory agencies issue findings. Licenses are revoked. Boards distance themselves. Executives deny intent. The public narrative shifts from innovation to deception. Markets respond quickly once uncertainty becomes evidence. Liquidity disappears. Capital preservation becomes priority. In many cases, exposure does not create the fraud, it reveals it. The architecture had been unstable. Verification removes ambiguity. Without ambiguity, illusion cannot persist. The speed of collapse depends on transparency. When documentation is released, confidence falls sharply. Invention fraud relies on controlled information. Public documentation accelerates this transition. Whistleblowers amplify it. Regulatory authority formalizes it. The moment of exposure is rarely sudden. It is cumulative. Evidence accumulates. Contradictions align. Narrative fractures. Once replication fails publicly, recovery is unlikely. Funding cannot compensate for non-functionality. Elite endorsement cannot override technical failure. Capital concentration reverses. The collapse phase confirms a structural truth. Fraud survives under opacity. It fails under verification. The pattern is consistent across centuries. Secrecy sustains illusion. Transparency terminates it. After exposure, legal consequences begin. Criminal investigations focus on misrepresentation. Prosecutors examine statements made to investors. Marketing claims are compared to technical reality. Financial disclosures are audited. In 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud. Sentencing followed in federal court. Restitution calculations were complex. Civil lawsuits proceeded alongside criminal cases. In 2013, the manufacturer of the ADE 651 was sentenced in the United Kingdom. Charges included fraud and false representation. Assets were seized. Export restrictions were imposed. In earlier decades, enforcement was inconsistent. Albert Abrams avoided major prosecution during his lifetime. Regulatory frameworks were weaker. John Keely faced lawsuits but avoided conviction before his death in 1898. Legal response often trails financial loss. Regulatory reform typically follows scandal. The 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act expanded federal authority over medical devices. Defense procurement rules tightened after documented failures. Corporate governance standards evolved following high-profile collapses. However, structural accountability remains selective. Not all investors recover losses. Not all board members face sanction. Institutions distance themselves from individuals. Executives frequently claim misunderstanding rather than intent. Defense strategies emphasize complexity. Ambiguity becomes legal argument. Settlements occur without admission of wrongdoing. Civil penalties are negotiated. Prison sentences are rare relative to total capital raised. The legal system focuses on provable deception. Systemic incentive flaws are less easily prosecuted. Innovation narratives remain socially valued. Venture capital continues funding high-risk ventures. Regulators balance deterrence with economic growth. Public memory fades over time. New technologies emerge. Legal consequences shape individual careers. They rarely dismantle structural vulnerability. Fraud adapts to new regulatory environments. Language changes. Technology changes. Enforcement improves incrementally. But the architecture persists. Legal accountability confirms wrongdoing after exposure. It does not prevent initial capital flow. The aftermath stage closes individual cases. It does not close the pattern. Financial systems absorb scandal. Markets continue. Innovation culture continues. The legal process provides resolution. It does not eliminate repetition. Fake inventions that raise millions are not anomalies. They follow structural incentives. The language of disruption appears first. The promise is expansive. Energy without fuel. Cures without limitation. Technology without constraint. The inventor claims breakthrough status. Complex terminology obscures practical verification. Controlled demonstrations manage perception. Access is restricted. Authority is recruited. Elite endorsements provide borrowed credibility. Media coverage amplifies visibility. Visibility accelerates investment. Investment increases valuation. Valuation substitutes for validation. Financial modeling replaces physical testing. Projected revenue precedes operational proof. Secrecy protects internal weakness. Urgency compresses due diligence. Investor psychology reinforces momentum. Institutional actors normalize participation. Government contracts legitimize claims. Accounting language extends illusion. Pre-orders appear as income. Licensing appears as adoption. Capital inflow masks functional absence. Verification is delayed. Whistleblowers disrupt narrative control. Investigative reporting introduces replication. Regulatory inspection reveals technical failure. Collapse follows exposure. Legal consequences focus on individuals. Structural incentives remain intact. Innovation culture rewards bold claims. Markets reward growth narratives. Media rewards novelty. Investors reward scale potential. Fraud adapts to each era's dominant technology. Steam engines in the 19th century. Electrical medicine in the early 20th century. Defense electronics in the early 21st century. Biotechnology and diagnostics in Silicon Valley. The surface changes. The architecture persists. Promise innovation. Control information. Secure funding. Delay verification. Fraud in invention markets is procedural. It is reinforced by alignment of incentives. Technology evolves. Human coordination does not. Where capital precedes proof, vulnerability exists. Where narrative outruns replication, distortion forms. Fraud adapts to innovation cycles, but its structure remains constant.